Entropy. All too often you'll read claims by atheists and Darwinian evolution advocates that the idea of life coming from non-life or a believed macroevolution would not violate the second law of thermodynamics. If you take nothing else away with you from this next chapter, it should be this. When any overall direction of change due to natural processes has been detected, evolution has only been observed going downhill, never uphill. There have been no exceptions to this rule. It's an observed law of nature. That is where the empirical science ends, and above and beyond that, the speculation of anything opposite to such often begins somewhere within Darwinism or atheism. And that's it. You could stop right there and not read on, and you've at least already got the basic point. However, because of the flood of arguments and bad information out there, from those who advocate their almost superstitious belief in upward change, and upward mutations, we need to look some more and examine it closely in more detail. Let's separate the proven facts from the vague imaginations. This observable downhill process is sometimes referred to as the thermodynamic gradient. Many choose to remain ideologically committed to naturalistic explanations due to the narrow definition imposed on the word science, and therefore it is constrained to natural phenomena only, through test and observation, to distinguish the known from the unknown, as a way of increasing knowledge. Or it could be that someone is emotionally intent on remaining a committed atheist regardless of what can or cannot be observed, because of emotional anti-religious reasons, especially perhaps a bias against older, more traditional belief systems, and so they will stay within the philosophy of materialist naturalism. What caused the universe to exist cannot be observed, but we do observe a natural law that points to a more ordered beginning, not a simple one. So, rational scientists point out the elephant in the room here, and it should not be ignored, when trying to explain how the tested observable physical evidence, even when mathematically described as a scientific law, and kept within the arbitrarily constrained naturalistic definition of empirical science, overwhelmingly demonstrates to those observing it, that every physical thing we know of so far must have begun in a more ordered condition. The question of how everything began more ordered, is an uncomfortable one for atheists, who protect their ideology of willfully denying God's possible existence behind the illusory philosophical shield of exclusive naturalism, so that the question about God's existence might be excluded from all speculation. But scientifically there is no getting around the empirical experimental problems with any of these strategies. The claim that quantum fluctuations evolved into humans is anathema for empirical science. And this, by the way, is not a straw man argument, as hard as it might be for many of us to believe. Some scientists have inferred this idea in one way or another. But those who are purported to be intellectual giants who advocate such fanciful upward processes from quantum fluctuations are simply wrong by scientific standards, because such imagined upward transformations are not supported by experiment and observation, and disagree with the second law of thermodynamics. This is the anti-scientific superstition of atheism. Anti-scientific because it goes against all experiments, superstitious because the opposite has never been observed to happen in the entire history of scientific inquiry, and atheism because materialist atheism is only valid if such an idea of upward change were true. But any notion of upward change over time is manifestly false, repeatedly scientifically disproven, consistently demonstrated to be the opposite of reality. In everyday life we see things becoming more messy and disorganized over time, and when left to nature itself, we never see such processes reverse. The law of decay is only one way. Isaac Newton was someone earlier who acknowledged the idea of everything running down when he wrote, "For while comets move in very eccentric orbs in all manner of positions, blind fate could never make all the planets move one and the same way in orbs concentric, some inconsiderable irregularities excepted which may have arisen from the mutual actions of comets and planets on one another, and which will be apt to increase, till this system wants a reformation." Newton, 1706 Optics, 2nd edition, quoted in H. G. Alexander 1956. The Leibniz-Clark Correspondence, University of Manchester Press. So it seems Newton argued that the universe requires intervention from the Creator, otherwise it would become more disorganized over time and eventually decay due to various motions and interactions. In modern times it has been realized that under extreme conditions, gravitational waves can significantly sap the orbital energy from orbiting bodies, so in principle, this is another way that orbits of planets eventually decay, although it takes a very long time. One of Newton's contemporaries, Leibniz, strongly objected to Newton's idea and wrote, "Sir Isaac Newton and his followers have also a very odd opinion concerning the work of God. According to their doctrine, God Almighty wants to wind up his watch from time to time, otherwise, it would cease to move. He had not, it seems, sufficient foresight to make it a perpetual motion." Leibniz, First Letter, in Alexander 1956. But Newton's ideas have ultimately held up over time, and in more recent history, probably since the invention of steam engines, such principles were later extended to include not just the motion and interactions of large bodies, like stars and planets, but also the most fundamental known submicroscopic particles of nature. Ironically, not just creationists but even an atheist like Richard Dawkins himself would probably say that it would be irrational to let anyone tell you how to think without good reason, since that would be intellectually lazy to put faith in such. Informed rational thinkers will acknowledge that science has proven it impossible to make a perpetual motion machine. And this is because of the very principle being discussed here. We must therefore approach these subjects with the neutral skepticism, open-mindedness, and logical critical thinking that they deserve, and make up our mind about them based on evidence, not only a belief, and certainly not from being clouded by anti-religious sentiment. One could imagine that perhaps such a person would take this skeptical position to prevent people from becoming overly dogmatic on certain issues. No matter what any of us think, we all need to challenge our beliefs. We all need to ponder that most complex device we have, that is our brain. And use it? In this case, how? Some say that belief in God is just a product of the human imagination because no human has ever seen God, which indeed in some sense is quite true. If there is an omnibenevolent, omnipotent creator with unlimited power and superintelligence, then why are there asteroid collisions, hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, various kinds of disease, an aging process, death, suffering, evil, and so forth? Intelligent design advocates might say that science alone cannot give us a complete answer. Others will postulate Darwinian explanations such as survival of the fittest or blind indifferent random natural processes, not from intelligent causation. But this fails to explain the amount of existing order that is still observable. But we certainly cannot ignore the amount of disorder at present. We cannot, in principle, ignore the chaos, evil, and suffering in the world. Nonetheless, it seems that conditions in the past were more ordered than they are now. To reconcile this intriguing paradox and find consistency in all of this, creationists often cite the biblical explanation for the order and the disorder. Essentially, the Bible gives us a narrative of how it all got here, how it all got messed up, and how it will get fixed. Those who are committed to constraining themselves within the philosophy of exclusive naturalism might find certain parts of this supernatural explanation philosophically objectionable. In this view, the biblical explanation provides us with a model to test, a just-so story, a description of how a rebellious supernatural being, identified as Satan, persuaded the first created man and woman to disobey God's one simple command and rebel against the Creator. So, an argument arose which contended that humankind could exist better without God's direction, and therefore God has allowed humankind to exercise their free will in this way, and to try out this kind of independence for a period of time, and then see what happens as a result, but with dire warnings about the consequences for those who choose to do so, and for now, unfortunately, also often for those who are trying not to. and since sin entered the world, God has removed himself from it until an appointed time, and since then all creation has been running down and degenerating, and larger portions of our world are becoming more physically corrupted and more evil, as time goes on. That's what is typically the argument from the book of Genesis, which the later biblical writers refer to, although the post-flood book of Job infers that in the supernatural realm the issue is also playing out and mankind has become part of Satan's ongoing miserable experiment until an appointed time, until the issue of universal sovereignty is settled, and so it is argued that this is the reason for much of the chaos we observe today. Philosophically, from a religious point of view, and for the long-term greater good, it would seem to be the statistically inevitable price for creating beings with free will, and might only seem justifiable if every wrong ever committed could eventually be mitigated by the all-powerful God, Jehovah. Hence the Christian doctrine. Many scientists, atheists, and naturalists object to these arguments based on the measurement problem and what they might claim to be the unfalsifiable aspect of it. So, how testable is it? We may well wonder, is there any scientific evidence that at least agrees with this biblical explanation? How does it compare to secular hypothetical models? Christians often cite the Bible as being a practical handbook to coping with life's challenges, and avoiding a lot of unnecessary problems, because it is seen by many as being divinely inspired by God, while others disagree. What do we make of all this? Some people in the modern technological era are skeptical of this idea that has been born from ancient writings, and choose not to believe in the existence of God. It follows, if a person chooses to dismiss all the archaeological verifications of the various biblical accounts as mere confirmation bias, and doesn't want to believe in God's existence, then they are left to ponder how all the order and complexity we see around us came into being. There are good empirical reasons why a scientist would require an alternative explanation of how complex integrated order can come from nothing, or at the very least, how it could ever emerge from randomness, uniformity, or chaos. The brain, for example, is considered by science to be the most complexly ordered object in the universe. And yet science has discovered that complexity has its universal nemesis, entropy. So, not just differentiation but also functional complexity is the opposite of entropy. Within any system you can imagine, for every functional complex arrangement of particles, there is an almost infinite amount of possible non-functional disorganized more entropic arrangements within that same space of possibilities, that is to say, allowed by that same system. Science observes finely balanced physical laws that enable our universe to exist, and all life within it to exist. Science also observes mind-boggling integrated complexity in the systems that make all life possible, such as DNA code, and a vast plethora of molecular machines inside cells, mostly interdependent on one another for their continued existence, and so that the pre-programmed self-replication of the total system, that they are all part of, is possible. What process puts such seemingly impossibly improbable functional arrangements together, instead of everything being a random evenly spread world of molecules? That idea, of course, does not even begin to address the question of why molecules existed in the first place, nor their intricate subatomic components, and the pre-existing laws that governed their construction to begin with. Someone, with a purely naturalistic worldview, would simply assume it to be that way from natural processes and laws of nature, despite the vast improbabilities that can be calculated from various systems and their possibility spaces. For those who believe the multiverse hypothesis plausible, that raises a more difficult problem of how many other less organized hypothetical universes there could have existed by chance as opposed to any possible organized functional universe, if it even happened that way at all. Nobody knows how to test it sufficiently, nor a logical progenitor of this imagined multiverse scenario. One of the main reasons for this idea is that atheists help to find an escape from the theological implications of the universe having a beginning, and it being fine-tuned. But, even if ultimately you could logically imagine, or mathematically somehow come up with, a satisfactory idea, of some past eternal naturalistic process, there is still a very fundamental argument that it might never overcome, in terms of avoiding the necessity of an intelligent creator, and that is the mathematically proven law of increasing entropy. Both empirically and mathematically this has been demonstrated in so many different ways, and in so many diverse systems, that the entropy law is ubiquitous. The theological implications of a more organized beginning seem unavoidable. Despite the many beautiful and orderly things that we see in nature, we also observe the relentless progression toward chaos and disorganization. Why does everything decay over time? Why does heat always flow in the direction of cold? Why do areas of high pressure expand and flow toward areas of low pressure? Why overall do things become colder over time and run out of energy? Why do things deteriorate in various ways? Why does specified information become more scrambled over time? What causes all these phenomena to always run down? In short, the law of increasing entropy is the overall definition for every type of decay. This is a common objection that is raised against the Darwinian evolution theory by creationists, ID advocates, many scientists, and others. Entropy is an observed phenomenon that can be tested and fundamentally described. It can be mathematically theorized, and in more recent times computer simulated, and the predictions made by these models have without fail been verified with empirical accuracy, and are repeatable. Some atheistic Darwinian evolutionists frequently hand-wave this argument off and claim that such arguments made by creationists are based on a misunderstanding of the second law of thermodynamics and the fundamental law of increasing entropy. Others, not so much. So it is important to take this argument seriously. Therefore we need to drill right down into the subject, not relying on just mathematical equations that invoke a convenient scale of reckoning, but more importantly examine the fundamental statistical logic that explains the first principles of this natural law. This convenient scale of reckoning is what is often referred to as being in the second law of thermodynamics. Evolution is a rather slippery word. According to the well-known creationist Henry M. Morris, Ph.D., the law of increasing entropy is an impenetrable barrier which no evolutionary mechanism yet suggested has ever been able to overcome. Abiogenesis or macro-evolution, vaguely imagined upward changes, and entropy, often produced from observable and computable downward changes, are opposing and mutually exclusive concepts. If the entropy principle is really a universal law, then, upward Darwinian, evolution must be impossible. The entropy principle is the law of increasing entropy, and is the fundamental explanation for the second law of thermodynamics, just so we're all on the same page here. It is explained by the mathematical concept of statistical mechanics to describe change over time, the evolution of all systems in nature, showing all systems head toward a condition of higher probability, more randomness over time, the fundamental explanation of why everything, so far known, decays. Some might view such statements as oversimplified, but it goes far deeper than that. Some people might mistakenly think that the underlying cause of entropy, or decay, is purely physical, when in fact, the underlying cause of it is predominantly mathematical, statistical, or informational. It is to do with the laws of probability. Probability is what largely governs the change over time, or the evolution, in the arrangement of parts at the subatomic, micro, and macro scales of any system in the universe, but in this case, it is a downhill evolution, not observably uphill. It is going downhill in the sense that it is heading toward more randomness, more disorganization, toward a condition of higher probability. Not just material objects but also specified information decays over time, in the sense that it becomes more scrambled and increasingly meaningless. There are many ways of defining the law of increasing entropy. Today it is known as the principal explanation for the second law of thermodynamics. It underpins why things decay, and how they tend to become more disorganized, random, spread out, equalized, more mixed and homogeneous as time goes on. It is commonly defined as being a measurement of disorder and randomness within any given system, although in some situations this definition is not adequate. It can also be viewed as the progressive loss of usable energy in a system. Another way of explaining it is looking at arrangements of things and seeing how they tend to head toward arrangements of greater disorganization and randomness when left to nature, that is to say, not intervened upon, where no outside energy or information is added to a system, so in this sense, it is a closed system, and thus more disorder and more decay are inevitable. Even these explanations sometimes do not completely describe entropy either, since some things that are mixed can separate and stratify, because of gravity and their different densities and particle sizes and weights. Snowflakes and crystals can form out of random arrangements of molecules below a temperature threshold. Perhaps the most comprehensive way of explaining it is that all things are heading toward a state of higher probability, or maximum uniformity, or a maximum state of rest, or towards maximum equilibrium, or they are becoming more the same as one another, or heading toward the lowest state of potential energy, depending on at which level of detail on which particular system it is being studied. The common thread in all these situations is, they do not reverse back to their previous condition when left to themselves. In some of those situations where specified complexity is not a factor, an inflow of more energy from an outside source will, in some sense, randomly reverse the situation, not atom for atom, but, according to the first law of thermodynamics, where energy conservation is taking place, according to the first law. But even then some usable energy is being lost in the transfer according to the second law. An example of this would be energy from the sun being fed onto one part of the earth at any given moment in time. Even living organisms that utilize the sun's energy still are subject to efficiency losses. But they start with highly ordered energy harnessing mechanisms already in place to begin with, and those highly functional configurations did not just magically pop into existence by themselves. Creationists argue that this runs contrary to the ideological part of the Darwinian evolution theory, which claims hypothetically, that things not only evolve in the observed downward direction of increasing disorganization, but can also evolve somehow in an upward direction and become more orderly, more organized, more differentiated, and more complex over time, due to natural selection, acting on imagined upward mutations and other unlikely happy accidents, and so this idea, for atheists, is a kind of placeholder for the ultimate creator of things instead of God. Evolutionists want to believe that not only physical things can somehow get more organized, but they want to also believe that functional information can somehow increase as well by some natural means of selection. Creationists accuse this idea of upward natural processes as being somewhat religious, which is manifestly ironic. Others even more harshly say that it is completely credulous. How specified does DNA need to be for life to be possible? In recent times, scientific investigation has begun to show that DNA contains a very organized functional code, and very specified, with a sophistication far beyond any computer code that humans have ever written. It requires much unsubstantiated belief to think that statistical mechanics would not also work against the genetic codes of each offspring from mutations and natural selection. Why would genetic code not also be, over successive generations, subject to the same law of increasing randomness and disorganization as anything else in nature? No one has observed anything different in this regard. Even the same generation of creatures age and die, let alone the long-term viability of their offspring's reproducible genome over many successive generations through time. How can the concept of Darwinian evolution be possible if everything in the universe is becoming more random and chaotic, and heading toward a state of greater disorganization over time? How can non-life spontaneously become life? Is life really that simple? Were life forms ever that simple in the past? Is that even possible to have some gradual process, from non-life, up to life? Can we even believe it to be possible, especially if we add to this problem of what creationists and many scientists claim is true, that the simplest forms of self-replicating life are irreducibly complex? But even if we could somehow convince ourselves that it were not true, how can things, in a certain localized area, ever go thermodynamically uphill, instead of always heading in the observable downhill thermodynamic gradient through time? Using reductionism, when any system has been observed in isolation, theoretically a closed system, why has there not ever been observed any exceptions to this natural law? The only logical retort is to suggest that it is logically possible, but to look for such a ludicrous improbability in so many highly complex systems is astronomically more difficult than finding a needle in a haystack. This retort then is almost certainly unfalsifiable, making the idea of upward evolution seem untestable and impossible, and therefore unscientific. One can certainly calculate the mathematical improbability within various systems of nature which, in systems relevant to this investigation, inevitably result in possibility spaces with numbers that are vastly many times the amount of fundamental subatomic particles in the observable universe. A common mistake some evolutionists make is by confusing the second law with the conservation of energy in their analogies to try and show why upward change might be possible in an open system that receives raw energy input from the outside. Some things within a decaying system will go uphill, using the conservation of energy law, which is the first law of thermodynamics, not because entropy is reversing. And so we are still quite justifiable in saying that entropy never reverses. A ball rolling down a hill has the momentum to roll up another hill some way. A ball hitting the ground will bounce back up. Part of a water wheel moves upward as the wheel is turning. The temperature increases on the side of the Earth facing the Sun, etc., are all examples of conservation of energy, but such energy is still flowing toward less usability. Randomness continually increases overall and energy is becoming less and less usable, and it never goes the other way. This is the law of diminishing returns, and it is happening throughout the entire universe. It is these tiny niches within this framework that the philosophy of materialist evolutionism tries to stay tenable, but it is a shrinking zone of willful ignorance. If a student is sitting for a science exam, they would never want to rely on this type of stupidity to help them pass it. So, it's important to recognize the first law of thermodynamics. It describes how the total amount of energy in the universe is always the same. It can change its forms, but the total amount remains the same, whether it be available for use or not. The total amount of energy is always conserved in the universe. It can neither be created nor destroyed. It simply breaks down into different forms of energy of an equivalent amount. In essence, decays into other forms, or might include smaller amounts of the same form as part of the total breakdown, but the total amount of energy always exists as one form or another and remains the same amount, some of it usable, some of it not usable, and the unusable portion continually increases over time. Morris says, the first law is itself a strong witness against evolution, since it implies a basic condition of stability in the universe. The fundamental structure of the cosmos is one of conservation, not innovation. However, this fact in itself is not impressive to the evolutionist, as he merely assumes that the process of evolution takes place within the framework of energy conservation, never stopping to wonder where all the energy came from in the first place nor how it came to pass that the total energy was constant from then on. It is the second law, however, that wipes out the theory of evolution. There is a universal process of change, and it is a directional change, but it is not an upward change. This argument has never been successfully refuted with properly conducted experiments. Nevertheless, committed evolutionists, and atheists, in an attempt to protect their worldview from collapsing in deepest humiliation, have to argue that this is a misunderstanding of the second law. Their belief system requires them to accept the idea that localized micro-reversals of entropy can happen if greater entropy is happening elsewhere to compensate. However, no localized reverse violations of this law have ever been observed. This doesn't necessarily mean that it never happens, depending on how you define it, but it has never been seen or definitively measured in any real way. You can make a mathematical argument to show the probability of a localized micro-reversal of entropy, but in complicated systems, the amount of possibility space required for such a calculation goes way beyond the amount of known fundamental particles in the observable universe. And so, it therefore becomes immediately obvious that the universe is neither old enough nor big enough to make the idea plausible. It is also tenuously speculated that an out-of-equilibrium fluctuation has a remote chance of producing more specified complexity, that nature can select for survival and preservation, but that would require somehow achieving subsequent replication, for further improvement, which seems like implausible superstition. Since there is no empirical evidence for this hypothetical preservative localized anti-entropy, it remains outside of science, and so far, the said ability of such fluctuations has only proven to be an article of faith for Darwinian evolutionists. It seems that such ideas are still incapable of explaining the origin of functional integrated complex biology, even the simplest irreducible function of self-replicating life, found in the cell, which is not simple at all but has complex functionality beyond imagination. A scientifically illiterate Darwinist might argue that a seed that germinates and develops and grows into a complicated plant structure is an example of increasing complexity, but in reality it is not, but instead is a downhill process stemming from the specified information already programmed, which earlier on in the process was contained inside the seed. So fundamentally, we are asking how it is possible to have an increase in specified information. All physically integrated complexities are contingent on this more fundamental question of specified information. The only empirical observations of increasing specified complexities that have ever been demonstrated by humans in the real world are humans causing it. Cars, planes, computers, etc. are all ultimately products of intelligent guidance and not just natural process alone. Nobody has observed biological specified complexity increase, but there have been observed numerous times decreases, commonly known as mutations. Which group of people are more superstitious? Biblical creationists, or materialist evolutionists? According to scientists and creationists and consistently repeatable experimental evidence, everything is heading downhill, hence the entropy law obtained from rigorous measurements. But despite this, against all known observations, Darwinian evolutionists like to speculate and hope that some things, yet to be discovered, might be able to go uphill, and somehow have an increase in their complexity, caused by unknown mindless natural processes and natural selection. It is truly breathtaking the amount of dogmatic speech on various websites that religiously and credulously advocate Darwinian beliefs in this regard, despite all empirical evidence, experimental and experiential, to the contrary, and without exception. The overwhelming evidence-based falsification does not stop the evolutionist propaganda from perpetuating this anti-scientific dogma. This particular superstition prevails simply due to the pack mentality, peer pressure, fear of ridicule, loss of grant money, and loss of career. For those that go against such evolutionist propaganda, that pervades certain secular institutions that favor atheism or materialist philosophies by excluding the God question. Consensus doesn't change proven facts. The reason that entropy is now regarded in mainstream science as a physical law, and the fundamental explanation for the second law of thermodynamics, is because it has up until now withstood all empirical tests designed to try and falsify it, and therefore considered immutable, unchallengeable, absolute, unassailable, incontrovertible and indisputable, and that is now largely why there is now in physics the axiom, the second law of thermodynamics. This particular phenomenon appears to be undeniable and inexcusable, and therefore also the extrapolation that things started more organized. And the question of why we exist, and how we exist, might not be meaningless after all. How dare anyone take that away? To summarize, according to the first law of thermodynamics, energy is never destroyed but just changes form and is therefore conserved in the universe. The second law of thermodynamics, explained by the entropy law, says that usable energy is lost from a system because it either escapes out of an environment into a less orderly arrangement somewhere else, becoming more spread out and more uniformly distributed, or in a closed system heads toward a greater state of equilibrium, randomness, or being more evenly mixed, and more uniformly distributed. It is said that the entire universe is constantly heading toward maximum disorder, that is to say, maximum uniformity, maximum evenness, maximum smoothness, or a maximum possible state of rest, the lowest state of potential energy in a system, the theoretical heat death of the universe. It is said to be a downhill process. Actually, closed systems are only a theoretical idea for the experimental purpose of reductionism. We can, by isolating parts of the world and postulating rather idealized conditions in our problems, arrest the increase, but we cannot turn it into a decrease, said the famous astronomer, Sir Arthur Stanley Eddington. In reality, as far as anyone knows, there is no such thing as a closed system in the absolute sense, because, even these so-called closed systems, will over time, eventually decay. Some say that protons might be the exception to this rule. Atoms eventually decay, depending on their various types, that is the type of element. Some have a higher probability than others of decaying in only seconds or minutes, days, years, decades, centuries, millennia, or possibly over millions, many billions, and trillions of years according to the laws of probability due to the uncertainty and random behavior of the subatomic particles from which they are made. For example, the simplest element, hydrogen, apparently takes vast amounts of time to decay if ever, perhaps quadrillions of years when not subjected to the extreme conditions of a star, although there is currently no experimental evidence that proton decay occurs at all. However, some postulate that it might occur by the extreme forces around black holes. But the element radium decays very quickly by comparison, which is not limited to extreme conditions. Radium emits alpha particles, 2 protons and 2 neutrons bonded together, believed to be made possible by the theory known as quantum tunneling. It emits also beta particles, high-energy electrons or positrons. It also emits gamma rays, the most energetic wavelength of light. Newton was unwittingly starting to get a glimpse of what has been postulated by many physicists, that in the distant future the entire universe is progressively becoming more and more disorganized and will end in heat death, where all the atoms might disintegrate and all the energy will eventually dissipate, and if protons are not truly closed systems and do decay, then this might be true. It still seems an open question, although atoms can be smashed apart in particle accelerators. Indeed, there are subatomic particles in the universe traveling significant fractions of the speed of light and are bound to occasionally smash into each other. So, many seem to agree with Newton and also take the argument even further in that it appears that without divine intervention, heaven and earth might indeed pass away, but even after matter and energy have dissipated, it seems that the laws would remain, if the whole thing were left to run its natural course. The word entropy was invented in 1865 by German physicist Rudolf Clausius, who lived 1822 to 1888. From Greek entropia, meaning a turning toward, from en, meaning in, and trope, meaning a turning, a transformation. Clausius invented the word entropy in 1865 for what he called the transformational content of the body. The word is said to state predictively that the entropy of the universe tends toward a maximum. Martin J. Klein, the scientific style of Josiah Willard Gibbs, in A Century of Mathematics in America, 1989, this idea is still generally accepted and has become part of the structure of thermodynamics, according to the definitions of mainstream science. Morris says, the word entropy means literally in turning. It is derived from the two Greek words en, meaning in, and trope, meaning turning. The concept is of something spiraling inward upon itself, exactly the opposite concept to evolution. Macro-evolution is speculated or imagined but never witnessed, change outward and upward. Entropy is observed and verified, change inward and downward. Ludwig Boltzmann, who lived February 20, 1844, September 5, 1906, developed a deep statistical understanding of why entropy is increasing, possibly everywhere in the universe. The Boltzmann equation is well known in physics. His belief in the existence of atoms was disputed at the time, due to either skepticism, dogmatic willful ignorance, and ridicule from some of his more prominent contemporaries who had very big egos, which was very discouraging. Tragically, it was only after Boltzmann committed suicide that atoms were proven to exist, and his theory of statistical mechanics was more firmly justified, and the entropy principle was more thoroughly understood. In order to understand the concept, an intuitive illustrative way of explaining it is best for most people. It is not a difficult concept to understand. If you want to be a physicist or an engineer and have accurate measurements of it, then it is to your advantage to learn the mathematical equations. For the rest of us, it can be easily understood using illustrations and examples in everyday life. We can simply start by looking at things we see around us in everyday life. They all decay over time. Things become messy over time. Metal rusts. Things corrode. The heat from a fire radiates outward and the fire eventually goes out. A hot object transmits its heat to a cooler object. The air inside a room tends to become evenly dispersed at the same pressure and temperature in all parts of the room. Orderly arranged things become more disorganized and random, and more spread out or more evenly mixed as time goes by. Light, heat, radiation, and all other forms of electromagnetic energy tend to spread out into space. All these things are in some sense irreversible and are different manifestations of entropy increasing. So, what do we make of all this? For one thing, there is an asymmetry to the process. It has never been seen reversing. It seems to overwhelmingly have a one-way direction through time. Why is this so? Why have none of these processes in closed systems ever been observed reversing? When something decays, the situation doesn't reverse. When we drop something and it smashes, obviously it is highly unlikely that all those resulting fragments will ever reassemble themselves back to the way they were before they were smashed apart. Why? Because, mathematically speaking, there is only one way for it to reassemble to the way it was before, but virtually an infinite number of other ways for things to happen differently, instead of happening exactly in the reverse from which it smashed apart. So these systems contain vast possibilities but usually only one organized possibility, and in this case all other possibilities disorganized, what seems to be an infinite amount of random possibility space. We can ask the same question about the possibility space of all possible biological genetic mutations, and how many of those possibilities will turn out beneficial for survival, within the genome of the organism's offspring. We can also ask if any of those rare beneficial genetic mistakes would ever represent upward change, an overall improvement, if they could ever produce an increase in the amount of functional information of the genetic code, instead of just diminishing returns. And even if on some incredibly rare occasion there was this vaguely imagined, super unlikely, upward mutation, involving information gain, how many degenerative deleterious mutations would be passed on to the offspring along with it, and also along with each successive generation of offspring? It seems from this that the only logical conclusion we can draw is that the organism must continually devolve, continually accumulate more and more entropy within its genome, with each successive generation of offspring. This also might provide a scientific way of determining the age of a species' existence, based on its rate of decay, that is to say, its rate of devolution. This basic principle of virtually infinite improbability can be applied to entropy in general and is said to define the direction of time's arrow. In reality, the number is not always quite infinite but probably finite, but large beyond imagination, almost beyond description. For the number of different possibilities within some complex systems, although some believe that the possibilities in many of those systems may be infinite due to the Heisenberg uncertainty principle at the micro level of reality, where it is impossible to know both the exact position and momentum of a fundamental particle, and so, according to one interpretation, it is largely indeterminate. Either way, the probabilities that are invoked are a measurement of our ignorance. Determining the level of entropy in a system is therefore stating our level of ignorance of the system, because no human can track the position of every molecular particle in a system at any given time, and so we can only sum it up in a more convenient scale of reckoning, known as the second law of thermodynamics, an overall measurement of the amount of randomness in an otherwise ordered system, which therefore is our amount of ignorance of that system, a specific type of ignorance. It is interesting that in science, arguments from ignorance are usually frowned upon, but in this case it is a scientific law. We thus might have to either re-evaluate arguments from ignorance or scientific laws, and by extension both secular and non-secular belief systems. This deeper explanation of phenomena first started to be realized back in the early days of steam engines. People like the Scottish scientist James Clerk Maxwell and others wondered why the compressed steam inside the cylinder of the engine wanted to equalize with the air outside, which was therefore pushing the piston. When the existence of atoms was proven, it was asked, what were the individual atoms doing to produce this effect? This led to some profound implications about the workings of nature, and not only of the universe's possible future, but also sheds light on some aspects of its past condition, and perhaps its origin. Even before the Big Bang theory had been accepted in mainstream cosmology and before the steady-state theory of the universe had been discarded, even when theoretical physicists postulated the universe as being past eternal, without a beginning to its existence, some physicists were starting to realize the profound implications in the law of increasing entropy. At Cornell University, Richard Feynman described the character of physical law and how it gives us the distinction of past and future in one of his famous lectures.